The prayer before Bunker Hill. Americans remember Bunker Hill for smoke, for red coats climbing, for powder running low, for the grim instruction not to fire too soon. They do not always remember that before men entered that storm, many believed they were stepping into something more than battle. A test, a judgment, a cause laid, however imperfectly, before God. My name is Benedict. No, not that one. Today, I will tell you about the prayer before Bunker Hill. By June of 1775, the Revolution was still young enough to be doubted. Lexington and Concord had already drawn blood. Boston was surrounded. Militia crowded the hills and fields around the city. But no one yet knew whether this resistance would harden into independence or collapse into punishment. And so, when the order came to occupy the heights near Boston, the men who answered it did not march as a polished national army. They marched as farmers, tradesmen, clerks, laborers, men with muskets, uneven powder, and souls carrying the full weight of uncertainty. Breed's Hill, though history remembers Bunker Hill more readily, became the place where many of them would learn whether courage could stand against empire. But before the firing began, there was another feature of that camp Americans too often forget: prayer. Not one single famous prayer preserved word for word. Not one perfect scene painted neatly for children. Something more real than that. A spiritual atmosphere. Ministers moved among the men. Chaplains spoke. Officers and soldiers alike lived in a culture where war was not merely strategy, but moral trial. Many believed they stood under Providence. Many believed the justice of their cause mattered. And many, knowing they might die within hours, sought God before they faced the British line. This was not unusual in the revolutionary generation. The colonies had fast days, prayer proclamations, sermons on public duty. The language of liberty and the language of moral accountability often traveled together. Men did not simply ask whether they could win. They asked whether they were right. That question has steadied many frightened souls. At Bunker Hill, it mattered deeply, because courage without meaning often breaks under pressure. Men can endure danger more readily when they believe suffering belongs to something larger than fear. And on that hill, fear was abundant. The British were professionals. The Americans were not. The enemy would come in disciplined lines, with bayonets, artillery, and the confidence of empire. The men behind the earthworks knew what was coming. And so prayer, in that setting, was not ceremonial decoration. It was preparation. Not for comfort, for sacrifice. One of the figures hovering over this moment was Dr. Joseph Warren. Physician, patriot, leader. By June, he had already become one of the most important men in Massachusetts. He had every reason to preserve himself for higher command, for political leadership, for the long future of the cause. Instead, he chose to fight. Not from the rear, cloaked in status, but on the field. That decision gives the whole scene a deeper moral weight. The Revolution was asking men not merely to speak of liberty, but to hazard themselves for it. Warren did exactly that. And he would die there, before the Declaration, before victory, before the nation could assure him his sacrifice had not been in vain. That, too, is part of the prayer before Bunker Hill. Not just words offered heavenward, but lives placed, trembling and unresolved, into the hands of Providence. When the battle began on June 17th, the Americans fought fiercely. Twice the British advanced. Twice they were thrown back. Only when American ammunition ran dangerously low did the Red Lines finally break through. The British took the ground, but they paid for it dearly. And the Americans learned something vital. They could stand. That matters more than many tactical maps can show. Because Bunker Hill was not merely a contest of position. It was a revelation of endurance. A people still becoming a nation discovered that courage, conviction, and sacrifice could bloody even the finest army in the world. Prayer had not spared them suffering. It had steadied them through it. This is often how Providence appears in history. Not as escape, not as ease, not as the convenient removal of pain, but as strength enough to endure what must be endured. The men before Bunker Hill did not pray their way around death. Some prayed and then died. Some prayed and then fought. Some prayed and then watched friends fall beside them. But they did not go into that fire empty. And that made a difference. History often asks whether prayer changed the outcome. That is not always the deepest question. Sometimes the truer question is whether prayer changed the men who had to endure the outcome. Before Bunker Hill, many Americans asked not only for victory, but for steadiness, for courage, for the ability to suffer without surrendering the cause. That prayer, I think, was answered. And before the smoke rose over Bunker Hill, there were men on that hill who understood that liberty might demand their lives, and bowed their heads anyway.